Hello and welcome to another video. Before I started this project, I got a little bit obsessed with In a Week by Hosier, and this is where the inspiration for this came from. I tend to listen to songs to death, and I get a lot of my inspiration from music and TV and film, so that's where this one has come from. I constructed the base by cutting and gluing some foam board and sticking it together. I previously made a little test piece with some techniques that I wanted to try out so that I could do them without any consequences. So that was my little test piece. I decided at this point to cut a big hole in the foam board. I do later change this, but please bear with me. So my vision for this was to make a diorama of a little patch of woodland and have some skeletons kind of being unearthed from there. So I made a soil base out of acrylic paint, gesso and some textured medium that I had, and I just spackled it on there to try and make a kind of muddy ground. I then moved on to sculpting the skulls and bones of the skeletons. Please do not look too closely because they're not anatomically correct at all. I am not the best sculptor, so I just wanted to get one side of the skull right so I could have a good bit poking out of the earth. And then I made a little pelvis bone, hip bone, and some little ribs. Once all the pieces had been baked, I used chalk pastels to shade in some of the areas. After the base coat had dried, I realised I wanted a little puddle to make, so I cut another hole out of the base and then made a new concoction with some scenic soil, acrylic paint and texture gel. Once I'd made it muddy enough, I placed my little skulls in there. But once the skulls were in place, I realised that it didn't really make sense that just the skulls would be exposed and not the whole skeleton, so I added some more mud in there to try and make it look a bit more feasible. I then started flocking with some fake grass, some moss and some leaf litter. I wanted the environment to look like it had just been rained in, so I made a little puddle out of UV resin. It was at this point that I realised I hated the massive dip in the middle, so I tried to gently remove all of the clay pieces that I put in there. Some survived better than others, and I did have to resculpt one of the skulls because it got destroyed in this process, but I am glad that I did it because I do prefer how it turned out in the end. I cut out some bits of foam board and glued those in to create a little platform for me to cover it over and try and disguise the mistakes I'd made. After another coat of soil icing, it was now my job to disguise where the seam was, which took a few coats of this mixture and a lot of flocking. I also cut out some little divots so that I could fit the skulls in properly, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. First I placed down a couple of ribs and added in the soil mixture again around it to make it look like it was half buried still. And then I popped the skulls in and added some more pastel blushing afterwards. Now to make the ground cover look cohesive once again, I ordered some things from Green Stuff World, which is based in Spain. It's a miniature company and I absolutely love the stuff that I got. The brown micro leaves and the spring leaf litter I used a lot in this project, and I just think they brought it to life and made it look like a proper forest floor. The polymer clay pieces were still looking a bit too bright and stark white, so I added some more pastels to make them a bit more earthy and like they'd been buried for a long time. I found this mossy piece of wood in my local park and I knew it would be absolutely perfect for my diorama. I did bake it so that it was safe to use and there weren't any bugs in there, and yeah, I absolutely love all the moss and the lichen and just everything about it. To cover up the very wonky sides of my foam pieces, I made a little box border out of some matte board and painted it matte black, and then just glued it all together to make it look a little bit more professional. I did some research on the kind of flowers that you can find in English woodlands, and I decided on a few to make. So here I'm using paper strips and glue and a Posca pen to make some wild anemones. To give the flowers a better shape, I pressed them with a dotting tool into my finger so that they curled up at the edges, so they weren't just flat flowers. Here I used a very similar technique to the previous flowers, and I cut some teeny tiny yellow strips to make the petals for some lesser celandines. And yes, I did have to Google how to pronounce that. For the centres of these flowers, I mixed some teeny tiny bits of paper with some orange paint. I wanted these flowers to have stalks, so I used individual threads of embroidery thread and painted them with PVA glue to make them stiff, and then I super glued them onto the flowers. And the final flower I chose were dog violets. I made these by cutting circles out of some tissue paper and then I shaped them by scrumpling them up and then sticking some embroidery thread, much like the last ones, for some stalks. No teeny tiny forest would be complete without some teeny tiny mushrooms, so I made these ones. I just made little balls out of some polymer clay and baked them in the oven. I modelled these ones after the mushrooms that grow where corpses are found, so they're found in graveyards quite a lot, or where dead bodies are buried. I also made some flat mushrooms so that I could make a chicken of the woods later on. After dusting these mushrooms with some chalk pastels, I cut out minuscule pieces of metal wire, glued them onto each mushroom, and then I painted them with some matte acrylic paint. I then moved on to painting the chicken of the woods. And here is my plate of goodies. Please ignore the flowers and leaves that you haven't seen before. I ended up not using those. If you'd like a tutorial on those, I'm happy to give one, but they just didn't look realistic enough for me and they just weren't matching the vibe, so I left those ones out. This was definitely my favourite part of the process, getting to use all the teeny tiny little things and scatter them around and just see everything come together. I absolutely loved it. From when I first made the flowers, I really wanted to place one growing out of one of the skull's eye sockets, so this is where I did that. You would never guess how many time-consuming and fiddly different techniques I tried to make forget-me-nots before discovering I could literally just use a dotting tool to dot them on. And with that, we are ready for the final reveal.